So what is the state's role in funding local schools? And how is that linked to the major financial challenges school districts face? The answer to both questions begins with the revenue limit. Once upon a time, the state decided how much aid to allocate for schools, but local school boards decided how much they wanted to add to that amount through local property taxes. Not so anymore. In 1993-94, the state put a cap on the amount of money per pupil that a school district could spend in state general school aids and local property taxes combined. The vast majority of a school district budget comes from the revenue limit. It drives what a school district can and cannot provide for its students. What is the revenue limit per pupil for Wisconsin, you may ask? It is different for every district. That is because a district's revenue limit today is based on what it was spending in 1993 when revenue limits were established. It drew a line in the sand that is now frozen in time. Frugal districts were essentially locked in to low spending levels, and any disparities between districts at that time is now baked into the school funding landscape today, as this map illustrates. In the map, districts are coded from red to green, with red being the lowest spending districts and green being the highest. As you can see, the vast majority of districts are orange and red. These are the districts on the lowest end of the spending range, and they tend to be small and rural, whereas the green, blue, and yellow districts tend to be located in a few of the population centers around the state. Notice how many cases where you can see a low spending district surrounded by higher spending districts. In some cases, they are receiving thousands of dollars less per pupil than their neighbors, and that number is going down because their enrollment is likely declining. More on that in a moment. Imagine how this affects their ability to compete to fill teacher shortages or provide high-quality programming. In 2022-23, the lowest spending district received just over $10,000 per pupil, while the highest spending district receives more than double that amount, just over $26,000. The average falls much closer to the minimum at $11,888 per pupil. In essence, the relative amount that a student's district was spending per pupil in 1993 determines how much they can spend today. In other words, the spending floor for education in Wisconsin is not based on student need, the cost of educating their particular students, or a minimum amount of educational services, but rather an arbitrary amount that was determined 30 years ago. So what recourse have districts had to cope with the disparities and low spending caps that persist because of revenue limits? Many districts have taken advantage of one of the only forms of recourse available to them. They have asked their voters to override their limit and raise property taxes through an operating referendum. Since 2013, the year after revenue limits were drastically cut as part of Act 10, 259 districts have exercised that option to go to operating referendum to try to remedy their situation. Although the vast majority of those ballot measures passed, over the past 5 years, more than half of all Wisconsin school districts have either failed or not gone to referendum at all. In effect, referendums have widened the disparities between districts that revenue limits put in place in 1993. We'll talk more about referendums in a moment. Another key impact of revenue limits has to do with inflation. When the limits were first adopted in the early 90s, they increased every year at the rate of inflation. But that stopped in 2009-10 when the legislature removed those automatic adjustments during the Great Recession. But inflationary indexing was never put back in place, even if you take into account a new per pupil aid on top of revenue limits that started in 2012-13. In the chart, the blue line represents the actual combined adjustment in the revenue limit and per pupil aids from year to year since 2008-9. In 2012, school districts actually saw an average cut of $554 per pupil as part of Act 10. And in 6 of the last 8 years, there has been no adjustment in the revenue limit at all, including the last 2 years when there was also a zero increase in per pupil aid, meaning school district general funding has been essentially frozen for the last 2 years, just as they are working to recover from the pandemic and at a time when inflation is at a 40-year high. The gray line shows where annual adjustments in per pupil funding would have been had they been allowed to increase at the rate of inflation as they were designed to do. So despite some media accounts of more and more money pouring into Wisconsin schools, The facts are that buying power of education funding has been falling behind inflation since 2009. To be specific, school districts have lost over $3,200 per pupil since inflationary indexing was stopped. If you count just from 2012-13, after the Act 10 cuts, that amount is still more than $2,200 per pupil. For a district with just 1,000 students, for example, that's $2.2 million in general operating resources. Understanding how state aid and local property taxes are capped by the revenue limit is essential to understand, because it means the state can claim to invest millions in education while providing no more resources for schools. As long as the revenue limit rises less than the rate of inflation and less than the amount of state aids, as it has since 2008-9, school districts will have fewer resources, not more, just to maintain the current level of educational service. The investment in school aids acts, in fact, as property tax relief, not money for schools. Over time, school districts have coped by finding savings wherever they could, and that included using the one-time savings allowed under Act 10, keeping staff pay below inflation, and many other strategies. But again, when there are no more savings to be had, districts have turned more and more to their communities, asking them to raise taxes on themselves to support their schools through operating referendums. But as we've discussed, many of the remaining districts have found it difficult to do that. Here's a look at one consequence of the way K-12 funding has taken shape in Wisconsin over the past couple decades. Wisconsin's national rank in per pupil spending on K-12 education has dropped from 11th in the nation in 2002, when it was spending 11% above the national average, to 25th in 2020, when it was spending 5.6% below the national average, the largest drop of any state in that period. And that was before the freeze in general revenue over the 22 and 23 school years. Because of that freeze, we'd expect to see that ranking to fall even further when the new census data come out later this year. In this environment, it makes little sense to talk about a return on investment in schools. Rather, the state's fall in national rankings suggests the return we are seeing on over a decade of disinvestment. Given the importance of K-12 education as the foundation for the state's workforce, economy, and civic life, when we see this kind of trend, it may be time to think seriously about how far Wisconsin is willing to fall relative to the rest of the country. So what is the trade-off for using state school aids to hold down revenue limits? You end up keeping the overall tax burden low. As K-12 spending has lost ground, we have seen a historic decrease in the state and local tax burden. In fact, in 2022, Wisconsin's state and local taxes as a percent of income fell to its lowest level on record. And contrary to statements by some state leaders, Wisconsin's tax burden also compares favorably in the region and is in the bottom half of states nationwide. In this map, the bluer the state, the lower the tax burden. The grayer the state, the higher the tax burden. You can see here that Wisconsin's state and local tax burden is the lowest of any neighboring state except Michigan, whose tax burden is very close to Wisconsin's. These trends challenge us to ask, at what point do we see diminishing returns in educational quality? At what level of tax savings do we start to curtail our students' chances of career success, or lose our best and brightest to other states that are willing to invest in the future of their teachers, children, workforce, and economy? What is the right balance between investment in education and tax relief? Inflation isn't the only thing squeezing school district budgets. We'll discuss 3 more major factors that are key to understanding the state of K-12 education finance in Wisconsin: special education, declining enrollment, and educator shortages. School districts must now absorb the rising cost of student needs, especially those related to the pandemic. A big factor here is the rise in special education costs. Although school districts are mandated by both state and federal law to meet the needs of students with disabilities, funding for those mandates has not come close to covering costs in over 20 years. The dark blue bars in this chart, measured on the left axis, show the amount of aid the state has appropriated to reimburse school districts for special education costs since the 2001 school year. The right axis and the light blue line show how that aid translates to the rate of reimbursement for special education costs. Starting in 2008-09, right around the same time that revenue limits were tightening, the state kept special education funding flat for more than a decade while special education costs were going up, resulting in a downward trend in reimbursement levels. With some modest funding increases in recent years, reimbursement has risen slightly, but still covers less than a third of what it costs to serve the needs of students with disabilities. This forces school districts to pull from already strained local budgets that are there to support all students, including students with disabilities, depleting resources for staffing, pandemic recovery programs, reading supports, career and technical education, technology investments, building maintenance, and so on. Across the state, school districts transfer more than $1 billion every year to cover that funding gap. That's why we're hearing a consistent refrain from both the governor and school districts across the state, asking for both general spendable resources and a significant boost in the special education reimbursement rate. Together, those two funding sources would not only strengthen the support schools can provide for special education, but preserve critical resources for all students. Declining enrollment is another major challenge for school districts. This map shows a time progression, where districts grow darker as enrollment declines and lighter as enrollment increases. Starting with 2005-06, watch how many school districts grow darker, meaning they're experiencing enrollment loss. As the map shows, enrollment has been falling in the majority of Wisconsin school districts, the vast majority of which are small and rural. In fact, more than half of Wisconsin students attend districts with fewer than 1,000 students. At the same time, enrollment is on the rise in a small number of population centers, as you can see in the number of yellow and light green regions appearing. By 2021-22, 3/4 of Wisconsin students are located in less than a third of the state's school districts. You might have noticed how this map bears a striking resemblance to the revenue limit map we saw earlier. The small rural districts experiencing the deepest enrollment declines are also the ones already at a financial disadvantage in being at the bottom of the revenue limit scale. These patterns follow steady demographic trends such as an aging population, a decline in the birth rate since 2007, and a resulting decline in the share of school-age children since at least 1990. The problem is that under a per-pupil funding model like we have in Wisconsin, school districts don't shrink well, especially small ones. That's because costs don't fall in step with enrollment declines. Fixed costs, like facilities, fuel, energy, and curriculum, don't go down just because a district has fewer students. And because enrollment declines usually are spread across multiple classrooms, grades, and schools, districts can't easily cut the high-cost expenses such as teachers, staff, or the number of classrooms without compromising instruction or class size. Declining enrollment is not a partisan issue. It is just a demographic reality that has immediate impacts on school district finances and their ability to serve their students in the context of historic inflation and several years of frozen revenue limits. But it's also a challenge that asks us to consider long-term structural solutions, as we'll be dealing with it for a long time to come. And this brings us back to operating referendums. As we've been discussing, one of the only tools school districts have to cope with the pressure of these costs is to go to their local taxpayers to ask them to pass an operating referendum. In his 1993 budget address, Tommy Thompson laid out his vision for the revenue limit, saying, "I want to freeze the property tax rate at December 1992 levels. If local governments wish to spend more, they'll have to ask the taxpayers. My guess is the answer will be no." Fast forward 3 decades later, after years of compounded underfunding, and we are seeing rising trends in the number, amount, and passage rates, as shown by the green line, of local referendums to raise the caps on school revenue limits. The chart clearly illustrates how the rise in operating referendums, the red bars, coincides with the state pulling way back on revenue limit authority, first by decoupling annual increases from inflation in 2010, and then by allowing no increases or very small increases in many recent years. In the absence of state support, these are communities electing in many cases to tax themselves in order to support their schools. Increasingly, districts aren't trying to boost resources for new initiatives, but just to continue current operations, maintain staffing levels, retain critical academic recovery positions that will be needed long after COVID relief monies have run out, and to keep compensation competitive with the private sector to retain staff. The year 2022 marked the highest number of operating referendums since at least 2000. But as we've discussed, school districts' ability to access this coping strategy has been uneven and arguably inequitable. Between 2002 and 2022, 112 school districts have not held a single referendum, and another 87 have held only one. But there may be a limit to how long these trends can continue. The passage rates of non-recurring referendums in April 2023, for instance, were lower than they have been in over a decade. It's just one point in time, and factors affecting referendum passage are hyperlocal. But K-12 education observers are still concerned about what it could mean for the future of public schools in Wisconsin. Clearly, districts are signaling they need more school resources to survive, much less thrive. But school referendums can be extremely divisive to a community. They're fraught with risk and uncertainty, and they divert substantial time and resources away from educational instruction and leadership. It may be time for state policymakers to seriously consider adopting a more systematic and equitable approach to meeting the needs of Wisconsin's future workers, parents, and leaders.